All right, it looks like we have, I think, a lot of attendees now in the webinar, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Catherine Lyons. I am the Director of Policy at the Economic Innovation Group. And again, really pleased to have you join our latest webinar in our series on opportunity zones. We're really pleased today to have two really fantastic guest speakers who will talk about investing in local opportunity zones to drive Main Street revitalization and how they have used the opportunity zone incentive in their communities of Harvey, North Dakota and Brookville, Indiana, to really see a kind of revitalization of the main streets there. So excited to have Paul Gunderson of Harvey and Jenny Wills of Third Place Brookville joining us today. If you go to the next slide, we'll go through the agenda and just a few housekeeping items. The first of which is that we are recording this webinar and we will post this recording along with the slides and a recap of the conversation shortly after, usually within about a week or so. And we'll make sure to distribute that material to everybody who is registered for this. So you'll get this along with the links that we talked about and the ability to rewatch this shortly after. In terms of, we'll also have some time for questions, hopefully, at the end of this. So if you want to just submit Q&A or any questions you may have into the Q&A function on the webinar throughout the presentation, please do so. And hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes for questions at the end of the presentations. We'll also try to, if they're relatively straightforward questions, we'll try to answer those throughout the presentation. But for those more directed at our guest speakers, we'll do so at the end. I think that is mostly it in terms of the housekeeping for our agenda today. We will, as we usually do, kind of kick off with a few opportunity zones updates and resources from that we've developed or been tracking over the last month. And then we'll go into really the meat of the presentation. So in terms of updates and resources, we always like to kind of showcase some additional, updates that are aligned with the topic of the webinar. And so here we have a few. One I wanted to particularly note was in Erie, Pennsylvania. You have probably heard us speak about the downtown revitalization efforts of Erie, Pennsylvania, using opportunity zones probably several times throughout the course of this webinar series. And after many months and many years, actually, of hearing about some of the exciting projects in the works, we finally have the opening of the food hall, which is one of the kind of cornerstone projects of that downtown revitalization. And Rachel is adding into the chat links to all of the articles that we'll talk about here. And so I'm sorry, Rachel, for going out of order. That probably kind of messed up your linking there. But anyway, I was just excited to talk about this one because it's been in the works for a while. And so this article talks a little bit more about the food hall, the vendors there, and some of the entrepreneurship opportunities that have been provided as this food hall has been developed. And doing well by doing good, investors that seek returns that are more than financial from the in the Main Business Journal. I think this one is really focused on some of the investments happening and being spearheaded by Arc'teryx as well, especially in the kind of the Saddleback Mountain area ski resort, and kind of revitalizing that, turning that into a new kind of destination and recreation center in a high need community. And just generally talking about the overall trend, though, of investors in opportunity zones that are indeed seeking kind of benefits for communities, in addition to financial returns, but also as a real focus and thesis, of their investment portfolio. In the second article here, Build Chillicothe cuts ribbon on the first property. I think this is a really fantastic example of kind of like block by block, house by house type investments in opportunity, using the opportunity zone incentive to kind of revitalize single family homes in this area. and taking either just distressed or kind of blighted or homes, and using that substantial improvement clause within the statute to using OZ dollars to kind of overhaul those houses and provide additional housing for particularly for those that have been kind of hard hit by the pandemic. So I think just a great model there that really showcases some of the important kind of smaller investments, but really having a real meaningful impact on the community there. And then finally, the last article is a major investment. So kind of on the other end of the spectrum, a kind of much bigger project, in Greenville, South Carolina, off of the Poinsett Highway, really redeveloping a plant, a manufacturing plant, and it will just be sort of very multifaceted in kind of their approach, really mixed use. But the kind of foundational aspect of this is creating sort of an innovation district, a hub for entrepreneurship. So it's really exciting to see that. Again, a sort of a manufacturing plant that's not currently used and being completely redeveloped, using opportunity zones equity to really revitalize kind of that area and provide another opportunity for another space for entrepreneurs, among other aspects of that project. It's quite a kind of substantial one. So I think with that, on the EIG fact sheets, I think we've shared these over the last couple of webinars, but just wanted to again, kind of put these in the chat here for folks as a latest resources from EIG about investment activity, proposed legislative improvements that we're continuing to advocate for, and then some of the socioeconomic characteristics of OZ communities. I will note on the investment activity fact sheet, the GAO report, which I believe we mentioned on our previous month's webinar, actually updated some of those numbers. So we know that even from that fact sheet that's only a couple months old, there's even more newer data that shows that the scale of the market is even bigger than we thought or we had access to, from previous data from the JCT. So again, exciting as we get more and more a clearer picture, opportunity zones, we're just really getting a better understanding of the size and the scale of the market. And then lastly, we put up a recap of our last webinar on investing in severely distressed opportunity zones from last month. And that featured the folks from Baltimore and some of the projects that they were doing. And Arcterra and their investment in the Pittsburgh Hill District, I believe, and some of the operating businesses there. So that was great, and encourage you all to take a look at that recording and the slides in that recap. So I believe with that, I will pass it back over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And so as part of the broader context for this discussion today, what I've been really encouraged to see is a lot of local activity happening and announcements recently, and both as a response to pandemic-related economic impacts, but also as smaller towns are probably better positioned now more than ever to grow. They're thinking through what their opportunity zone strategy could be, and they're attracting private capital. And so I just wanted to share a few stories here, one of which Catherine's already shared about this great community in Ohio that has started their own fund. But first, we'll start with the Brakeman in Lebanon, Indiana. This is a project that's been 4 or 5 years in the making and just recently broke ground. It's an $8.5 million mixed use project. It's going to mostly be multifamily housing, market rate multifamily housing, but also some retail and a restaurant on the first floor. And, we've talked about it a number of times. A lot of times in communities that haven't seen a lot of new housing development in recent years, there's a problem with getting comps in order to secure financing, in order to build new housing. And so when we see these examples of market rate housing occurring in communities that aren't, large metropolitan areas, sometimes we dig a little bit deeper to understand what the context was and what the impact of that OZ investment has been, especially relative to their ability to leverage or attract private financing. So that's in Indiana, and the mayor was quoted in this article as saying, you know, we have, there's a lot of attention in our city right now. We've been positioning ourselves for growth for the past 5 years, and we're ready to make it happen. So that's kind of the mentality, I think, in a lot of smaller towns or mid-sized towns throughout the nation. So there's another example in the neighboring state of Ohio. The Lima Opportunity Fund. This is a model that Arcturus, that we just mentioned, has used a number of times. In fact, we discussed it during the last webinar, where they will go in and they'll partner with the city and local stakeholders, in this case, the Lima Chamber Foundation, as those folks make investments that then Arcturus leverages up with additional private investment. And so in this case, the city and the Chamber Foundation have joined together to make a $5 million investment, which will be leveraged with a $20 million investment from Arcturus. And as those funds revolve, it could create, you know, between 80 to 100 million in investment for the city in both real estate activity and operating business. And as we talk about Main Street Revitalization, you know, we really think that the flexibility of the Opportunity Zone tax incentive does allow for this. Some people call it an PropCo strategy. So operating company and property company, where you're allowed to invest in both the real estate and operating businesses. And it's really impactful for Main Street revitalization efforts. In Springdale, Arkansas, which is a smaller community that's in, I believe, the northwest part of the state, there was this great announcement of this public-private partnership with the city of Springdale to create mixed income rental housing. And, you know, I wanted to highlight this as an example of just because you live in a small town or a mid-sized town doesn't mean that you don't have affordability challenges. They are definitely targeting affordable housing, and they're using this as an example of how to do that. A lot of times where the housing vacancy is low, if you add just, you know, a small percent of population, you get an affordable housing crunch, because there's not enough supply to adequately serve everyone along the spectrum of income. So for folks who are looking for examples of how to create affordable housing in smaller towns, this public-private partnership is a really good model. And then, as Catherine mentioned, this other great community in Ohio, Chillicothe, they have created their own opportunity fund, and it's managed by downtown Chillicothe. So it's one of, I think, a handful of examples of where the jurisdiction or a subsidiary of the jurisdiction has come through and said, we're going to create an opportunity fund. We're going to leverage potentially local capital in order to invest in our community. And we'll hear a little bit more about that throughout the presentation today. But this particular initiative was launched in May of 2020. So right at the start or early days of the pandemic, and was meant to be a response to the pandemic. And it's, as Catherine mentioned, their initiative to acquire and renovate properties in their town. So we can go to the next slide. So I am really excited because I think, you know, for folks that have listened to our webinars before, I've described the initiatives that are happening in Harvey as well as in Brookville from time to time as my favorite initiatives. I've described them both that way, and I think it's true. Both are my favorite. So this feels like a real kind of all-star panel to me. And I cannot wait for the presentations that are about to follow. But for folks who are curious about where North Dakota's opportunity zones are in relation to Harvey, North Dakota, which we're going to hear about momentarily, we got a map here for you. I'll also drop in the chat this really great article from called Thriving on the Prairie for folks to read either during or after the presentation. And then we can go to the next slide. Similarly, in Indiana, here's Indiana's opportunity zones, pretty spread out. But if folks read our Indiana report that EIG did about a year ago, you'll be very familiar with what's happening in Indiana, some of the capacity building measures that the state and a local nonprofit called LISC took to help build the marketplace and direct capital to where it's needed the most. They also did this really great, I think, use case of what has been happening in Brookville, Indiana, called Community Leaders Use Opportunity Zones to Bring New Life to Small Town Indiana. And I'll also drop that in the chat, but just wanted to give you guys that context before we go ahead and welcome our guest speakers on. So with that, I think we can turn it over to Paul. I've talked with Paul a number of times over the past couple of months. I think this is one of the Opportunity Zone's best kept secrets, what's happening in Harvey, North Dakota, a town that's, you know, has a 1,700 person population. And I know I'm not going to do it justice. So from here, I'm just going to let Paul tell the story and share the great success that they've had there.
Well, thank you, Catherine and Rachel. It's a pleasure to join all of you today as we explore together this particularly useful mechanism going forward for economic development, at least for some sectors of our nation's economy. So advance to the next slide, thank you. And I'll just comment briefly on the features that are attached there, because that gives all of you an idea of what this community is typically about. We're located in a very large agricultural region. We're located in the center of a region where everyone has to travel about 60 miles in any direction to get to another community the size of Harvey, which means that Harvey is the retail center for the whole region. And at this point, I must confess, I'm also working with the city a good bit about transforming itself ultimately from strictly retail into a destination, but that's another story for another day. We did apply as a community to become an opportunity zone. We noted that 25 were permitted in North Dakota. We ultimately emerged as one of those, although our income levels, largely due to agricultural fluidity, almost disqualified us in the year that we applied, but we sneaked through. The mention of agricultural activity has proved essential to us because across the state of North Dakota, the North Dakota Agricultural Extension Service has indicated that nearly 70% of the fixed assets for all agricultural producers in the state will be going on either the sales block or the auction block beginning in 2022 for the next roughly 12 years. That tells you something about the median age of most of our agricultural producers, but that also means that in most cases, these enterprises have garnered enormous asset activity and empowerment, which has led to significant issues with transfer of property to the next generation or outright sale of the assets. And I can speak to that more generally in a moment if you should like. We decided to include our entire city in the opportunity zone. We could do that because we were a part of a somewhat larger zone that is used for assessing the rural-urban split by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So we included our industrial park as well as our downtown Main Street redevelopment and virtually all of our Renaissance zone. And that decision also proved crucial going forward because that allows us to cap and build and stack in ways that maximize opportunity zone investments. A few of our buildings in the zone also qualify for historical reservation credit, and that has worked quite well for us for two of the projects that we have booked locally. Okay, just a brief note. The photo on the bottom represents something that the city is quite proud of. It is virtually in the last 14 years rebuilt its entire infrastructure, whether it's streets or avenues or the water system or the sewer system, the fiber optic, everything else, all has been totally rebuilt in that period of time. So the city, many people will tell me, really looks quite pretty because all of the streets are newly renovated with fresh asphalt, and everything is relatively clean and neat looking. We'll take the next slide then. Okay, let me just go through the process for those of us that may not be totally familiar with how one goes about this business. First of all, we had to create an opportunity zone portfolio. That was, I say have to, because the whole assumption behind opportunity development zone capitalization here in North Dakota was premised upon the notion, which was embedded in the congressional authorization of the Tax Act of 2017, premised in the observation that there would be an opportunity for qualified zones to recruit significant resources from outside the zone that could be imported into the zone, and largesse attributed to various economic development entities, private investors, and that kind of thing would be seen in the zone. Frankly, our experience is not that at all. But nevertheless, we did create a portfolio, and it was helpful in that it brought us through a process of looking at ourselves from the perspective of investment attractiveness. And I think for some of our local entrepreneurs, particularly those who had been here a while, that was an eye-opening experience. The next thing that we did as a community was meet with our local financial institutions and various legal offices. And these included, of course, legal attorneys, as well as numerous individuals involved in providing financial services, not only to agricultural producers, but also to the trucking firms that are located in our city, as well as to individuals who have invested and travel weekly to the oil patch to the west of us, about 80 miles, and complete their activity every week and then come back to Harvey to spend all that money on weekends. At least that's our hope. We did go through the process of creating qualified opportunity funds. Actually, I probably should have corrected that a little bit. We have basically three different types of funds that have been created locally. As you may know, individuals who wish to use this mechanism can self-certify in the year that they decide to activate their capital gains portfolio. But we also created a group opportunity zone, which provided for those entrepreneurs who really didn't want to go through the individual process of creating their own zone, but who were willing to collaborate with other opportunity zone entrepreneurs and co-fund and place in one general fund the resources that they are bringing into the development. They are responsible, of course, for tracking their own resources, but the fund exists for that purpose. I would add that we also registered this fund with the North Dakota Securities Commission. I would imagine that in most of the states where our listeners are engaged in this conversation today, that would be expected as well. It's one way of ensuring that investors are protected suitably and that the resources stay where they belong. The third way that we approached this was to contact regional and national fund managers and indicate that we would earnestly desire their look-see at our opportunity zone portfolio. I must confess, I've only had a couple of inquiries resulting from that particular activity. However, one of them is still considering Harvey, so perhaps something will evolve there as well. I return to comment about our agricultural producers because they are so important to what's happening right now. I met with virtually all of the accountants who serve our agricultural clients across this area, as well as legal counsel, and also other financial servants, largely in the accounting arena, but who do provide a good bit of advice to agricultural entities. Let me just indicate that to give you some sense of the scope on the agricultural side, the typical agricultural account held by any one of the 4 banks in our community, on an annual basis, that account will borrow about $1.2 million annually to fund its operation on an annual basis. And of course, all of that is paid back, and then new funding is secured for the next production year and that kind of thing. So that gives you some sense of the scope here of these kinds of activities. They've got a lot of risk and exposure, but there's a substantial amount of revenue that is flowing through those banking accounts. I would add that ultimately we did experience equity investments because some producers have found, as they begin the process of asset transfer, that the benefits associated with investment in an opportunity zone are potentially very helpful. We've heard about the tax deferral part, but that's not the only part. For agricultural producers in particular, the step up in their cost basis is very pronounced. Let me just cite one example for you. It's an active example right now. I'm working with a household that is preparing to transfer assets, and the surviving member of that household was astonished when she discovered that the actual cost that she and her husband had ever paid for acreage. They own roughly 1,200 acres here, and they had made purchases across time along a continuum from about $19 an acre to about $87 per acre, way back in time. She will be passing that property off in just a few weeks, and the purchase price is $3,239 per acre. That means that on a transformational basis, she is experiencing an asset uptick and step up, which is relatively speaking enormous. And so she's working through various mechanisms right now with her financial consultants and her legal staff to maximize the benefits that have been made available by Congress across time for such purposes. Next slide, please. Just a couple of visual examples of businesses here on Main Street. We've been focusing on Main Street redevelopment because we subscribe to the notion that when communities start losing Main Street, they start heading in the wrong direction. When I came aboard in early 2018, almost 20% of our Main Street buildings were vacant. That means 18 buildings. Today, 2 are vacant. And I expect they're going to be gone in the next year. So there is opportunity. It's not only due to the opportunity zone, it's also due to the resilience of this community and its willingness to kind of pick itself up from the bootstraps and reinvest in itself locally. But I would add a couple of things. I bring these 2 up. They're not the only 2, but they were also willing to follow best practices relative to renovation of structures and placement of entrepreneurial capability within. For example, although they didn't do their signage the way I would have hoped, 90 degrees to the face of the building so that you can stand on the sidewalk and you read everything going on down or up. Nevertheless, they were keenly interested once they learned of the concept of co-location. And as most of us know on today's seminar, co-location helps enormously when cultivating entrepreneurial talent in local communities because it lowers the overhead and the risks thereby substantially. So each one of these has brought in other allied business adventures, I would call them, but they've been successful to co-locate within their location. For example, Marcy's on your left side is not only a great coffee shop, but it's also, and that's the bean part, but it also has three complete hair salons, a very significant clothing store, which caters to women in our community who found it difficult except to order online if they were of petite size. She has also brought in two other businesses to co-locate with her that provide various forms of whole food ingredients and or the completed whole food product itself. Mosaic, on the other hand, brought in the first mental health wellness center in our community, and are doing very, very well by virtue of that. They've also brought in two Reiki practitioners. Those are folks that use various forms of relaxation and other techniques to ward off pain and all other forms of discomfort that people who sit in tractor cabs and truck cabs and railroad locomotives experience a lot of because they're sitting all the time on relatively poorly designed seating apparatuses in the equipment that they're operating. Okay, next slide. That ends my presentation at this point, and I'm certainly willing to answer any questions you may have as we go forward to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Paul. So there are a few things that I just kind of want to underscore because I know you shared so much good information, and we always do like a little recap afterwards. And one of the things that you were talking about is just the fact that you had 3 funds created locally. One of the questions that came in during the presentation was who is managing these funds?
That's an excellent question. Basically, we have a fund manager here locally, and he's doing all of that work. And there's, of course, a annual report that has to be submitted to North Dakota Security Commission and that kind of thing. So yeah, one has to plan for that type of thing ahead of time, so that one makes sure that one is compliant with virtually all of the regulations that exist at the state level. The federal level, you know, what's interesting about this whole initiative is there are relatively few guidelines and barriers along the side of the road that all of us are traveling. And so to some extent, we kind of self-created what we thought would be useful in order to provide the type of assurance that would reassure virtually all of our potential investors. But excellent question. Prepare for it so that you're ready.
Yeah, and I think in previous conversations, you had mentioned that there was 2 residents or a couple, one or both of which may have grown up in Harvey, but of course they moved away and then they just recently relocated back, and they're one of the local leaders who've really embraced this model of both investment. Yeah.
Yes, you're exactly right. The other context I perhaps should have mentioned, Rachel, is that we have a number of individuals in our community who did very well in the information technology industry across our nation, both out of both California and Oregon, and then the greater Kansas City area. And that's been an interesting phenomena for us to watch because these firms built their equity very quickly, and a lot of it. And now as they prepare to divest, or in our case, return to Harvey, as they one or both of these couples had Harvey roots, there was the opportunity to create, in each case, with these IT professionals, they have self-certified themselves.
Yep.
And that's one way to go.
Yeah.
Certainly, and it can work.
Yeah, and I love that story, or at least the trend that we're seeing where, opportunity zones, the policy was created with a thought that it would help to attract or deconcentrate venture capital off of the coast or out of the three main places where it's traditionally invested and into other places where it hadn't already readily flowed into those communities. But maybe that's not happening so much. And what we're seeing in some places is that what it's done is to establish and formalize local investing in a way that maybe we hadn't seen before, or at least spread out through more communities. Not to say that folks aren't investing off of the coast. So, outside capital isn't coming in, because it definitely is, but we're also seeing this trend of local investors, people who would have never thought or had a vehicle through which to invest are doing that.
Yes, you're right. And that certainly has been our experience. Quite surprising, actually, because the way this whole project was sold by our governor and regionally was, so let's see what we can do to bring dollars into the state.
Mhm.
And there has been some of that. But I would say, certainly in our area at least, nearly all of it has been local.
And so
people wanting to come in local.
Yeah, and the investment strategy has been both in the real estate as well as some of the businesses occupying that real estate.
Yes,
right?
you're right. And thank you, Rachel. I should have mentioned that the dollars have gone both directions. Acquisition of assets as well as building that initial amount of capital that's necessary to sustain that business during its establishment period.
Yeah, that's awesome. And again, I think that that's what, Jenny's going to talk about a little bit during her presentation, the different uses of the OZ investment in sort of a very concentrated place within the community. So we did get a question from Molly. Hi, Molly. That I think I'm going to save till the end because I think it's applicable to both Jenny and Paul. But Paul, thank you so much. Please stick around. We're going to have Q&A.
Right.
And let's transition over to Jenny. So I would say Brookville was a very early adopter of opportunity zones, and one of the earliest adopters in Brookville is Jenny Wiltz, and we are so thrilled to have her here. I will say, as a personal note, when I spent time in Cincinnati last summer, I've now moved to Cincinnati, but when I was here just visiting, I needed to escape the city for a day, and I took that drive up to Brookville just because I wanted to see the work myself, and it really is amazing. And so I'm so glad to have Jenny on to talk about the work that she has led alongside other community members and local leaders in Brookville. And from here, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel and Paul. That was a really wonderful explanation. Here in Brookville, we kind of did it backwards. Like we're just considering or working on getting a public or a localized fund. Our opportunity zones all started with private investment. And to give myself a little background, Mick and I have lived here for 40 years, came from the west side of Cincinnati. I don't have a place in government. I suppose I'm a concerned citizen. And we had our manufacturing businesses. His brother owned it. And I worked there for 30 years. And when they sold in 2018, they expected to get 8X for it, and they got 2X, which was quite incredible. We had already done a lot of planning. We didn't even know what an opportunity zone was, let alone that there was one in our town, until one of the brokers who helped us sell the business mentioned it to my husband. And then we got a hold of our local economic guy, and and there were a couple projects that were nearly shovel ready. So you can move to the first slide. So this is the town of Brookville. This is one of our major investments, redevelopments, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. So you can just go to the next slide too. So Brookville is rural, like 2,000 people, 20,000 in our county, but we are 45 minutes from Cincinnati, about an hour and a half from Indy. So you see by the map that we're kind of centrally located. We also have a 19-mile river, not a river, a lake, and it's been there since 1974. So we are a tourist town or a recreational town. So people come through from both Ohio and Indiana, even Kentucky. We're trying to get them to stay here. So you can go to the next slide. A demographic snapshot, and you can look, you have a low population, kind of a low education, the typical LMI stuff, which of course, that made us able to be qualified for the opportunity zone. So you can do the next slide. It's all these old towns. We had historical downtown, we had aging housing stock, income lag, blighted downtown, how to fit it all together. And it really is housing. Because if you don't have a place for your folks to stay or to live, it's really hard to attract anything here. So you can go to the next slide. So here's the Valley House Flats, and it opened in June 2020. It provides senior housing, 55 and up. It was a blighted main block directly across from our historical courthouse that had been bought by an outside family in a different county, and they had just taken the depreciation and let it go, and no one could buy it. We were not initially involved in any of this. A guy named Bruce Rippey from Batesville had done similarly to the Ron Weber factory in Batesville, and he came in here and started to go to work on this, and it was really quite the labor of love, or it was really hard to do. How we came involved is so it's 27 affordable units in the historical side, and then he wanted to build those the stories, so we'd have 20 market rate housing. We didn't have the comps like so many older towns do, or poorer towns, and he couldn't get commercial financing for the other 10 apartments. We didn't know him, we just heard about it, and so we invested directly in it. And I think Valley House Flats is one of the first completed opportunity zones in Indiana, mostly because the architect, all the drawings were already done. They were gonna do the 20 apartments, but then they didn't get it financed, and then we were able to come in and do that. So and another Valley House Tavern, I think it was one of the oldest taverns around here. There's going to be additional 300,000 OZ investment in 2022. So you may advance the slide. So the story with us too is that we do have a Franklin County Economic Development, and our Lido, they decided we needed there had been no new lodging in Brookville forever, and they had already done the feasibility study and already chosen Cobblestone Inn and Suites. Paul told me the other day that they actually have a Cobblestone Inn and Suites in their town, and they came in January of 19, and we found a site that we liked. We signed in, they came in January 19, we signed in June of 19, started building in January of 20, and we opened in October of 20. And that included all local investors. We had 2 of our other investors are also opportunity zone investors. So it's like I said, it provides lodging, and its occupancy was above projection. I don't know if you saw on the other slide, but they did fully lease up Valley House Flats during the pandemic. And it's not just in-state folks, as people come from all over, because it is even the markets are very good price, and you're living right downtown in the Main Street. Talk about revitalizing Main Street. You put 47 families right on Main Street in walking distance. It was it's quite a revitalization. So next slide. So the other business that Mick and I were directly involved in is we had one of the oldest newspapers here in town in Brookville. And as so many other newspapers, it had fallen on hard times, and had been owned by the same group of folks for a long time. And they, Mick and I own and operate a tavern called Third Place. And we have lunch on Wednesdays. And the 3 owners came in on a Wednesday. They don't all live here. Walked in and asked Mick if he wanted to buy it. And so that was an operating business that we ended up buying. That was in June of 19 also. So we've expanded to 7 weeklies. There's a couple towns that a more conglomerate type of newspaper had been providing them their newspaper, and then they ended up pulling out. And so we went right in. We didn't have to purchase anything. We went right in and providing local news by local people that we don't actually print here. We print up in Indianapolis, but all the news is located here. And as you can see, there's a few more challenges, you know, when you do an opportunity zone with a existing business. So you have to provide significant capital improvements. As you can see down here, are really kind of, I like to say, blend the old and the new. If you see the big white screen there, they had not had new equipment for years, but we still use the display racks on the side where they do the cut and paste, when cut and paste was really cut and paste. So really proud of that. And our partner, who was in the newspaper with us, was actually gifted half of his one of the owner's stock, because that owner had mentored him for years. And Brian actually worked for the newspaper. And so Brian and his family lived in Indianapolis. He grew up in Brookville. He just moved back to Brookville with his family about a year ago. And the paper, we were struggling, but things are really making a move. We're doing more multimedia too. So we're really proud of that too. And when you talk about investments, would these have happened if there weren't opportunity zones? Mick and I may have done 2 of them. We probably would have done the Valley House Flats. That was kind of a no-brainer. That's really turnkey for us. And I like to think we would have done the newspaper, but we would have been hard to do 3, but to do 2 for sure. So, but this made it almost a no-brainer. So, but it's backwards. I'm gonna say backwards. It's different than Paul's group because they started a fund, and so everybody's kind of collaborating. This was more independent. And now in our town, we are looking to get a fund, and we have a lot more people that are interested in trying to do the opportunity zone funding. So next slide. So, you know, we leverage community investment into grant funds, civic engagement, and collaboration. Essentially, it was about $4.5 million in OZ funds, and but it literally in the last 15 years, but more like the last 5 years, there's been over $45 million of community investment. It really does drive it along. You have to cobble it with other things, but it really does drive outside investment or inside investment, or just excitement in how the Main Street's going, and people are really excited to live here and to come here and to now live here. So next slide. So local strategies, how to replicate in your community. Actually, we had a meeting last week and invited our local folks, our accountants and our attorneys and real estate folks, and brought in some of our advisors that we use from Cincinnati and Indianapolis to talk about opportunity zones. Actually, a lot of folks around here don't even know what that is. And so that is something that we are definitely behind on. You need to make sure people know what that is. Do you have an elevator speech? Can you tell them really quickly? But you need to have, you know, a lot of information for them so they can move forward, or at least be in the group to move forward, to understand what they're, you know, what they're doing. So we had a meeting last week. It was really well attended. People were really excited about perhaps starting our own fund. And I learned as much from Paul, just what he was talking about today. So I'm really excited to reading those articles too. So you need to collaborate, and you need to know your economic development leaders and strategy. It sounds like Paul had a jump on all that kind of stuff, and utilize your local elected officials. And we were in silos around here, and the different kinds of or CARES money, or whatever you want to call it, that's coming into the different communities. We have been a beneficiary of that. And when there's money coming in, whether it's private investment or public investment, people will come to the table. And that has been a big boon for our community. I believe so. So I know that was a little quick, but anybody have any questions for me?
Yeah, Jenny, I would love to just kind of go through these projects over
Okay.
just so I can kind of share with you what I think are my favorite parts of your of these
Okay.
projects.
Okay.
So do you mind going back, Amelia, a few slides to the Valley House Flats, the first project?
Yeah.
So with the Valley House Flats, I know you said this is something that you probably would have done anyways. However, I think that sometimes there's this notion that a lot of the early opportunity zone investments, especially when projects were underway or they were already planned, that they were just easy places to put money. But I believe in our conversations that we've had that you said, but for the opportunity zone investment, there wouldn't be this additional 20 units of housing that was added to this.
Exactly. There wouldn't have been additional 10. He was going to do 20. He could only get financing for 10.
And
So,
and that means you have 10 new households potentially, as you said. Those households are frequenting the Main Street. Perhaps it's allowed folks to move back to Brookville or discover Brookville.
it truly has. There's folks that maybe would have moved back or planned to move back when they retired. But because just like Paul was saying, we had a complete, redo on Main Street with the infrastructure. And so people are moving back before they retire because they're able to work from home. We have the infrastructure, we have the fiber optic, and they can move here and still work and enjoy all this in their 50s.
Yeah, so maybe Brookville is one of these Zoom towns we keep hearing about.
I don't know about that yet, but
Yeah.
still it's and yeah, but Wi-Fi in the rural area, broadband is it's really rough, but they're
Yeah.
working on that. And we do have my husband and I own a small shared workplace where people do rent to get the higher bandwidth that they need.
That's excellent. And so the way I remember it is, Valley House Flats is on one side of the street, and almost right across the street is the newspaper, right? As you're
It's a
walking.
block down, right across from Valley House Flats is the courthouse.
Yeah, and it has like a cute statue in front of it. Do I remember that
Probably
correctly?
a rooster, some kind of rooster or chicken.
Yeah,
Brookville holds Brookville holds the world record, Guinness World Book of Records of frying the most amount in one single serving of fried chicken, which was like 2010. Fried chicken is very regional here, and it was one of those things that we did. So that was kind of our little meme, if you will, or theme, if you will, in town.
Yeah, well, I love the statue, and we can go to the next slide. But what I find really interesting about this investment is just on a national level, or sorry, this is Cobblestone. We'll talk about Cobblestone in a second. But just on a national level, we're seeing local outlets disappear. So like, I think there's like a fourth of newspapers have gone out of business in the past 15 or so years. And so being able to ensure that there's a way for you to tell your story locally, for folks to communicate with each other, but then also bringing it online where we know most people get their news anyways. I think that this is just so important that this investment was made.
Our partner, Brian Noah, he like I said, he worked at the Democrat when he was young and then came back. So he managed it 6 months when he was in Indy, but now he lives here. But you're so right about the local news, because the problem with our newspaper before we bought it was people were putting a lot of editorials about national stuff, and it was just insane. And we did finally replace our editor, but people don't care about, like I said, you can get your news wherever you want.
Yeah.
I mean, national news, but local news, people want to see the colored top half of what's going on in their town. They want to see local news. The folks who go to the local meetings, they go to the county council, and they go to the Brookville Town Council, and they sit and they report what happened. And then they want to see what their kids are doing in the sports. I mean, it's big. Yeah. And like I said, be able to essentially write 7 weeklies from the original building that Brookville was in. I mean, that the Brookville Democrat was in is pretty amazing. I'm not going to say it's easy. And we really, we had to utilize the PPP funds. We didn't lay off anybody. Obviously, we did have some attrition, which has worked really well, got a lot of new blood in. And and we hired a guy who's doing some video multimedia. We have more of an online presence. Same thing. People want to hear about interesting, good stuff that's going on. You can find all the other stuff somewhere else. So.
No, that's great. And then I know we are running short on time, but I do just want to talk about the hotel, because for folks that, I come from traditional community development where, you think high impact projects are affordable housing and grocery stores. And that's also true, but sometimes you don't necessarily think a hotel is a high impact project. But when you think about the tourism opportunities in Brookville, of which there are a number of them, and the fact that maybe you didn't have a place to capture those tourists overnight and make sure that they eat at your local restaurants and shop at your local shops, like all of a sudden a hotel seems very important as far as economic impact in your community.
It really was. And even as much as the tourists, but even folks who were coming home to spend the holidays with local, their family, but they didn't necessarily want to put them all up. They were standing there, and that was like in one of the most amazing things, and this is so rural. My husband saw a group of about 10 guys who were sitting in third place one night, and he see what you guys here for. He said, "Oh, we're here for the gray squirrel counting contest," and they were from Alabama, and they have been coming up every year. It was like $3,000 or $5,000 for the entry fee, and the first place winner got a brand new truck or something. We never even knew this existed. So many people didn't even know, and they were so thrilled to have the hotel. They had their dogs in their trucks, but there's all these different events that most people didn't even know that were going on, and now they're so happy, and they're all congregating at the Cobblestone Inn. So really, it just exemplifies, I guess, or magnifies what a unique and diversified area that we live in. And it's really a lot of fun. It's very satisfying.
That's awesome. Okay, so with the short time that we have, I'm going to try to get to 2 questions. And this is for Jenny, both you and Paul. The first question is, are you expecting to see any drop off in investment after this year? I think folks are aware that one of the tax benefits, the 10% step up in basis, is expiring at the end of this year. And so folks are curious about how investors may react. So that's one question. And then the second question is a question around how are local officials supporting or not supporting? What has been their role? So I will pose that to you both, and hopefully we can get some answers shortly.
As far as the parts of the OZ tax legislation expiring, I do think they expect some of it to be extended. When I had Jennifer Wesselman out here last week, that was part of it. So I don't think we're going to lose. I mean, obviously, if you got in first, that first, then you for sure you have that, that full benefit. But I do believe they expect it to extend. That's what I understand. Did you hear the same thing, Paul?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. That's the word from our congressional delegation as well. And at the same time, because of the economic impact associated with the known tax benefits, even at the lesser amounts, the savings are significant. So personally, I don't expect to see any relaxation at all of the intensity here. In fact, I expect it will build
I agree
as we, yeah. And then turning to the second question, I can't underscore enough how important it is to remain connected very tightly with your elected political leadership in your community and beyond. We started with the governor's office here, and I must confess that was really helpful, because from time to time, he and his staff have made, I would call steering commentary that has directed folks from outside to at least have a look-see at who we are. But more importantly, I made the discovery very soon into this process that without having a mayor and a city council fully apprised of what was underway here, I began with the private sector first, then went to the public side. I think that for most people and most communities, it would work better to go the other way with the public first and then the private. But that just happened to be my nature coming out of the private sector, as I did prior to taking this position as economic developer here for our city. But it's absolutely crucial because these are the folks in part who are merchandising the community. They're engaged with people who are interested in what's going on. And thank you, Jenny, for your comments about the newspaper. I couldn't underscore more deeply than you already have how important that entity is to creating the readiness for investment in local communities like this. So,
yeah, and I agree with Paul that obviously it was private. Now we're going to go public, but it would have been nice if it were the other way around. But we just weren't that organized then, if you will. And you need something to light it up. And our investment, our personal family investment did. And our local economic consultant, he always says he caught lightning in a bottle. That's what he always says. Because it was very short time period. We made a lot of decisions and it was pretty intense. So, but it was certainly worth it. And the momentum that we've seen and the excitement has been, Brookville is really poised and our Main Street Revitalization really poised to just do incredible things. Quality of life here.
Excellent. Well, everyone, go visit Brookville, go visit Harvey. They both have cobblestone hotels now, so you can stay there. But if you guys need to get a hold of Paul or Jenny, they've been kind enough to provide their email addresses, just in case we didn't get to your questions. And I'll turn it over to Catherine. I know we're a few minutes over.
I don't think there's anything else. Just thank you again for joining us. Again, just to reiterate that we will share a recording, slides, and a recap shortly after, probably within the next week, and distribute that to all attendees. So thanks again for joining, and thank you so much to Jenny and Paul. It was a really great conversation, and we were just so pleased to have you both on this webinar with us.